The rain hammered Portland like it had a grudge. 3 in the morning, and Sarah Chen pushed through the emergency department doors at Sacred Heart, her scrubs already damp from the walk across the parking lot. The fluorescent lights above hummed their mechanical song, the same frequency they'd hummed at 0300 hours in Helmand Province, if you listened to the right part of your memory and didn't listen to the rest. She moved past the intake desk with the efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary movement burned calories you might need later. Her calloused hands, the kind that belonged to someone who'd held more than stethoscopes, gripped her employee badge tight. The locker room was empty. Good. Sarah opened her assigned locker with the same deliberation she applied to everything, no wasted motion, no wasted thought. One photograph of her son, Marcus, taken last month at 17. Dark eyes like hers. A face that didn't yet know what she'd survived to keep safe. One dying succulent in a ceramic pot, brown at the edges. One cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. The mug had been a joke gift 5 years ago from a coworker who'd quit. Sarah kept it anyway. Keepsakes mattered. Keepsakes meant you existed. Her fingers found the edge of her jacket where it hung inside the locker, and she pulled the fabric toward her, her thumb tracing the stitching along the inner lining. The faded Army Ranger unit patch was so worn the colors had nearly disappeared into gray. She could still feel the texture though, the embroidered curves of the Ranger tab, the words underneath that had meant everything once and meant something different now. A ritual. Every shift, the same touch. Every time before she tied her scrubs, before she became just Sarah, the graveyard nurse who asked if patients needed anything and smiled when they didn't smile back. Her hands were steady as she performed the ritual. Steady as they always were. The nurse's station chatter drifted down the hallway. 2 voices, maybe 3, Rachel from pediatrics and someone else Sarah couldn't place. Something about Sacred Heart's new chief of surgery. The name came through clear as a surgical light, Dr. Marcus Sterling. Chief of surgery. Appointed 3 weeks ago from some East Coast hospital, some program where they'd loved him enough to let him leave, or hated him enough not to fight. Rachel's voice had that edge to it that meant drama was brewing. He apparently made his last chief of pediatrics cry. Actually cry. In the middle of morning rounds. Sarah secured her locker, the click of the combination lock sharp and final. She didn't look toward the voices. Didn't need to. The information registered anyway, new hierarchy, new authority structure, new variables to navigate. She'd navigated worse. You didn't survive 20 years in the system by being surprised by ambitious men with something to prove. Ambitious men were predictable. They needed acknowledgement. They needed audience. They needed the world arranged in tiers, and they needed to stand at the top, unquestioned. She dressed in her scrubs with the same precision she'd learned in naval special warfare. Every movement counted, every second was a resource. Her hands moved through the motions, elastic waistband, drawstring tied with a specific knot, pockets checked for supplies. Trauma shears tucked into the right pocket. Pen in the left. Badge clipped to the collar, hung at an exact angle. The jacket went over everything, hiding the patch, hiding the scars that mapped out her shoulders like coordinates to a place that didn't exist anymore. Or existed too much. Existed in the part of her that never slept even when her eyes were closed. The hallway stretched before her, linoleum stretching toward the emergency department like a runway. Her shoes, practical, white, worn at the heel from 1,000 shifts, clicked against the tile in a rhythm that belonged to no one else. The night shift had its own pulse. Slower than day shift. Deeper. Nurses on nights worked with the understanding that they were the only thing standing between the dark hours and chaos. No administrators walking rounds. No visiting families. Just the machines and the sick and the people who knew how to move through crisis like it was just another Tuesday. The emergency department was operating at half capacity. A 64-year-old male in Bay 3 with chest pain that the EKG had ruled benign. A 22-year-old female in Bay 5 with a migraine so severe she'd thrown up twice. A homeless man in Bay 7 with a lacerated foot that someone had found bleeding outside the MAX station. Sarah knew all of this without asking. You learned early in graveyard shift that information flowed differently at night. Fewer people meant everyone talked to everyone, and conversations wrapped around you like fog. She moved into position at the medication station, her hands beginning the ritual of checking stock, verifying dosages, ensuring that what the night demanded would be available when it arrived. This was her strength, not the heroic moment, not the dramatic save. The heroic moments belonged to doctors with degrees hanging on walls. Sarah's strength lived in the details. In knowing where everything was. In being ready when the telephone rang with a code. In being the person who didn't panic, didn't hesitate, didn't let the weight of the night press down on the patients who came through those doors. She didn't notice the parking lot security camera swinging toward the entrance at 2:36 a.m., catching the arrival of a charcoal-colored Mercedes sedan in the executive section. She didn't see the man who emerged from the driver's seat, tall, expensive haircut, suit that cost more than she made in a month, shoes so polished they reflected the parking lot lights like mirrors. Dr. Marcus Sterling had arrived for his first official day as chief of surgery at Sacred Heart, and the world he'd inherited was about to become very small indeed. But that wasn't what Sarah registered. What Sarah registered was the shift supervisor, Ellen, appearing at the medication station with an expression that suggested she'd swallowed something bitter. "New chief's on his way up," Ellen said, not looking directly at Sarah. "Just announcing it like a weather report. Someone should probably look busy." Sarah didn't respond. She simply continued her inventory. Looking busy and being busy were different things. She understood the distinction. She'd learned it in a language that didn't use English words. The elevator dinged. Once. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. And Dr. Marcus Sterling stepped into Sacred Heart's emergency department at 3:02 a.m., carrying with him the kind of authority that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His eyes swept the department the way a commander surveys territory, calculating, evaluating, categorizing. The nursing staff, the equipment, the patient monitors with their steady beeping rhythms. And then his gaze landed on Sarah, still methodically checking medication stock, her movements precise and economical. Her hands were visible under the harsh fluorescent lights, hands that bore no wedding ring, no jewelry, just the pale tan lines of someone who'd spent years in desert sun that had since faded. What Sterling saw was a middle-aged nurse with calloused hands doing a graveyard shift task. Competent enough. Unremarkable. The kind of staff member you found in every hospital, doing necessary work without drawing attention to herself. He didn't see the way her shoulders were positioned, chest open but feet always braced, back never against a wall. He didn't see the scan she'd performed of every exit when she'd arrived, the mental map of door locations and window positions that she maintained without thinking. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked movement in her peripheral vision, a habit so ingrained it felt like normal sight. And he certainly didn't see the patch inside her jacket, the piece of thread and embroidery that had cost her everything and bought her nothing but a locker in a hospital basement and a son who asked why she sometimes woke up screaming in the dark. Sterling turned away, already looking for the day shift supervisor, already making mental notes about which staff members showed proper deference, which ones might need correcting. He was the chief of surgery now. He'd climbed far enough that the ladder beneath him had become irrelevant. Sarah's hand found the edge of her jacket pocket, and her thumb pressed against the fabric where the patch lived underneath, just checking. Still there. Still real. The ritual complete, she returned her attention to the medication inventory, and the night continued its slow burn toward dawn. The rain outside continued hammering against the windows, and somewhere in that sound, if you listened closely enough, you could hear the difference between regular rain and the kind of rain that meant something was about to change. The medication inventory was routine work in counting vials, cross-referencing logs, the kind of task that required precision but not thought. Sarah moved through it with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done the same task 10,000 times. The rain continued outside, hammering against the emergency department windows with the kind of persistence that meant it would last until afternoon. She touched the unit patch inside her jacket without thinking, a gesture so automatic her hands completed it while her mind tracked for lines and surgical orders. The night was burning toward its end. Sunrise was 3 hours away. Morning rounds came at 6:30. Dr. Sterling swept through the trauma bay with his entourage of surgical residents trailing behind him like remora fish behind a shark, that particular species of medical student who had learned to mistake confidence for competence. They moved through the ICU beds in formation, Sterling stopping at each patient to deliver his pronouncements with the tone of a man accustomed to being never questioned, never challenged. His voice carried the specific resonance of someone born into money and educated into arrogance, each word arriving as if inscribed in marble before he spoke it. At bed 7, Sterling reviewed a septic elderly patient's chart. The resident presenting the case recommended a broad-spectrum antibiotic protocol. Sterling nodded approval, began writing orders. Sarah stood 2 feet away, restocking the crash cart, and something in the numbers on that chart caught her attention. She paused. The patient's creatinine was elevated. Kidney function compromised. The dose Sterling was ordering would accumulate in the renal system, building to toxic levels in 72 hours. Not immediately dangerous. But wrong. She set down the equipment and stepped forward. Doctor, that dosage would be contraindicated given the patient's renal function. Her voice was level, measured, devoid of challenge. She was simply stating a fact. The way someone might point out that a door was open. The room went absolutely still. Sterling's pen stopped mid-word. The residents froze. The attending nurse who had been charting 3 beds over glanced up and immediately looked back down, the universal signal of someone who had just witnessed something dangerous. Sterling turned slowly. His eyes found Sarah with the focus of a sniper acquiring a target. "Thank you, Nurse Chen." His smile was cold, the kind of smile that arrived without warmth, like a predator showing its teeth. "I'll take it from here." She nodded and returned to the crash cart. The moment passed. The rounds continued. But something had shifted in the electrical charge of the room. 30 minutes later, Sterling found her in the hallway outside the medication dispensary. He was alone, which meant he had planned this. His voice was low, quiet enough that it felt like a threat. "You embarrass me in front of my team." He stepped closer, invading the space that was supposed to be hers. "Let me be clear about something, Nurse Chen. Nurses observe. Doctors decide. You input when asked. You don't correct. You don't question. You understand." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. She did not feel fear. Fear required uncertainty, and she had eliminated uncertainty 20 years ago in Helmand Province. What she felt instead was recognition. This was the familiar pattern of predatory behavior, a man testing boundaries to see which ones would hold. She had faced commanders who ruled through intimidation and had learned that the only response was absolute calm. "I've worked with commanders who valued input from every rank, Doctor." Her voice was still level, still without challenge. It kept people alive. His jaw tightened. A vein appeared at his temple. He had expected submission and instead received something worse, the implicit suggestion that his leadership model was inferior. He leaned closer. "What you've worked with and what you work with now are not the same thing." He paused, letting each word settle like a brick. "And you might want to remember that." He walked away. Sarah stood in the hallway for one measured breath, then returned to work. By afternoon, the cafeteria was packed. Lunch rush meant every department crowded into the same space for 30 minutes, nurses, residents, maintenance staff, lab technicians all occupying the same compressed air and fluorescent-lit disorder. Sarah carried her tray to a corner table, turkey sandwich, apple, coffee that had the metallic taste of having been brewed 12 hours earlier. She sat alone, which was her preference. Solitude had become a habit and habits had become survival. Sterling appeared in the doorway wearing his white coat like armor. He scanned the room, located her, and began walking in her direction. Sarah watched this approach with the part of her brain that had been trained to track threat vectors. She noticed the slight acceleration of his gait, the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes had narrowed to points of focus. He was not walking toward her by accident. He passed her table, and his hand opened. The tray went with him, coffee sloshing, the plate sliding, the apple rolling across the tile floor. The sound it made was surprisingly loud. The entire cafeteria went silent in that particular way that silence does when something has just happened that no one expected. Sarah looked at the mess on the floor. The broken plate. The sandwich that had landed face down, the turkey splayed against the tiles like something wounded. The coffee spreading in a brown puddle that smelled like burnt almonds. Sterling did not stop walking. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge what had just occurred beyond the fact that he had stepped directly over the spilled food without breaking stride. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then the cafeteria resumed its noise, conversations restarting, the sound of chairs scraping, the determined loudness of people pretending nothing unusual had happened. Sarah knelt. She began picking up the larger pieces of plate, moving with the same precision she brought to every task. A younger nurse, maybe 3 years into her career, stood up from the adjacent table and moved toward her with a handful of napkins. "I've got it," Sarah said quietly. Not a request. The younger nurse hesitated, then nodded and returned to her seat. Sarah cleaned the floor herself. She threw away the food. She returned the tray. When she was finished, she had erased all evidence of what had occurred, except for the fact that it had occurred. The memory of it would remain in the room like a stain that soap could not remove. That was the point. Sterling was not trying to hurt her physically. He was trying to break something interior, some essential thing that held her together. He was testing to see if humiliation could do what resistance had failed to do, make her quit, make her disappear, make her leave. That evening, Sterling called a residents' meeting in the surgical conference room. Sarah was passing in the hallway, restocking the code cart, when she heard his voice carrying through the partially open door. Loud. Intentional. The kind of loud that meant someone was supposed to hear it. "I give her a week before she quits." Sterling's voice held the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything. The old guard can't handle the pace of modern medicine. Can't handle the standards we maintain here. I'll give her 7 days before she finds somewhere else to work. There was the sound of a whiteboard marker. The sound of him writing something. Sarah did not look in. She continued with the code cart, her hands moving with mechanical precision while her mind absorbed this information without visible reaction. A week. He had made a public bet with his residents. He had announced her deadline like she was a test case, a problem to be solved, a weakness to be exposed. The next day arrived with the same grey Portland sky and the same fluorescent lights that made everything look like it was being viewed through water. Sarah was in the hallway outside the ICU, reviewing a chart for a patient who had been stable overnight, oxygen saturation good, heart rate regular, pain controlled. The work continued. The world continued. She had learned 40 years ago that the world did not stop for your personal crises. Sterling approached from the opposite direction. He was alone, which meant this was deliberate. He took the patient chart from her hands, not asked, took, and hurled it downward at her feet. Papers exploded across the floor like birds startled from a tree. The chart struck the tile with enough force that several residents who had been standing at the nurse's station looked up in unison. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Sterling's voice was the voice of a man who believed he owned everything and everyone in this hospital. "And next time, don't leave incomplete documentation for the actual medical professionals. It's lazy. It's beneath this department's standards." He walked away before she could respond. Sarah stood motionless for 1 second. 2. The third second came and went. Then she bent down. The pages scattered across the tile. Patient vitals. Progress notes. Medication records. She gathered them with both hands, her movement slow and deliberate, each motion controlled. One page had landed under a supply cart. She stretched her arm to retrieve it. A single tear escaped her left eye. She felt it slide down her cheek and registered it with the same distant awareness she might register a patient's heart rate, information to be noted and filed. She did not cry. Crying required emotion and emotion required investment, and she had divested herself of that currency long ago. But her body was not always cooperative with her mind. She wiped the tear with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the chart in her other hand. No one was looking at her. Everyone had learned the protocol. When Dr. Sterling attacked someone, you looked away. You made yourself invisible. You waited for it to be over. Sarah stood, papers reorganized and secured against her chest. When she looked up, Sterling was gone. Only the residents remained, trying to appear busy, trying to appear like they had not witnessed anything. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and the electrical burn of fluorescent lights working too hard. She returned to the nurse's station and sat down. The shift would end in 3 hours. The rain was still falling outside. Somewhere in her jacket, the unit patch remained where it had been sewn 40 years ago, a relic of a person she was supposed to have stopped being. She touched it through the fabric and felt the familiar shape, worn smooth from years of contact. That evening, after her shift ended and she had changed out of her scrubs and pulled on her jacket against the Portland rain, Sterling was in his office making a phone call. The conversation was brief and precise. His voice held the particular satisfaction of a man initiating something he believed would end definitively in his favor. "I need you to look into someone for me," he said into his secure line. "A nurse at Sacred Heart. Sarah Chen. I need everything. Background, references, any incident reports. Anything that might explain why she's so determined to undermine my authority." He paused, listening. Then, "No, this is important. This is about departmental integrity. Make it happen by the end of the week." He ended the call and returned to his desk. The whiteboard in his office still displayed the single word he had written 2 days earlier, week. He looked at it with the satisfied expression of someone who had already won. But he had made a calculation error in the spreadsheet of human nature. He had measured her by the yardstick of ordinary people, and she was not ordinary, though she had spent 20 years ensuring that no one would know it. The rain continued throughout the evening and into the night, a steady percussion that drove everyone in Portland toward their homes, their dry places, their small certainties. Sarah stood at the bus stop downtown, her shift clothes damp beneath her jacket, her hands in her pockets, her face turned toward the rain. The bus was late by 8 minutes. She did not mind. She was accustomed to waiting. What she did not know, what no one in the hospital knew, was that the next 36 hours would alter the calculus of everything that was about to happen. A sedan and an SUV would meet at an intersection in the parking lot of Sacred Heart Memorial. A man would stop breathing in a way that required precision and training to reverse. And in that moment, in the rain at dawn, with blood on her hands and a pen barrel still in her grip, Sarah Chen would stop being invisible. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause as Sarah Chen finished her graveyard shift, her white Crocs splashing through puddles that reflected the sodium glow of the street lamps. 7 in the morning. 12 hours of bedpans and four-stands and the particular exhaustion that came from holding dying people's hands while their families yelled at you about wait times. She pulled her jacket tighter, the worn fabric doing almost nothing against the Portland drizzle, and walked toward the bus stop at the edge of the lot. Her fingers found the outline of the Army Ranger unit patch hidden inside her jacket lining, a ritual she performed every morning before stepping into the world, the faded fabric rough against her palm like a prayer. The buses wouldn't run for another 20 minutes. She knew this because she'd taken the same route for 3 years, always leaving at 7, always waiting alone in the shelter with the broken plexiglass and the smell of wet asphalt and diesel fuel. The morning was still dark enough to feel like night, that suspended hour where the city hadn't quite decided to wake up. She was thinking about the patient in bed 4, the one whose son had finally called after 2 years of no contact, when the sound came, a deep crunch of metal, followed by a shout. Sarah turned toward the entrance of the parking lot in time to see a silver sedan half-wrapped around the concrete light post at the north gate. The impact had driven the front end deep into the metal pole, the hood crumpled like paper. For a moment, the lot fell silent except for the rain and a single tire spinning uselessly against the asphalt. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone gasping for breath they couldn't quite catch. She moved before thinking. 18 years of muscle memory and 3 combat deployments don't erase themselves just because you're wearing scrubs and a name badge. The gravel crunched under her feet as she crossed the lot in less than 10 seconds. The driver was still in the seat, a man in his early 30s with dark hair and the kind of panicked eyes that meant oxygen deprivation was progressing faster than the brain could process. Medical resident Morrison. She recognized him from the halls of Sacred Heart, always in Sterling's shadow, always trying to look important. His mouth was open. No sound coming out. Just that terrible gasping, the sound of a man's lungs trying to work against pressure that shouldn't exist inside a chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax, Sarah said to herself, the diagnosis falling from her lips with the same certainty as breathing. The left side of his chest, she could see it even before she touched him, was expanded, distended, the skin itself stretched tight as a drum. The car wreck had fractured ribs. The jagged edges of bone had punctured the pleural lining. Air was escaping into the space around his lung, building pressure, collapsing his heart with every breath he tried to take. He had maybe 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. She reached through the driver's window and placed 2 fingers on his neck. The carotid pulse was thready, barely there, his heart racing at a rate that told her every second mattered. The car door was jammed from the impact, the frame bent inward. She didn't waste energy on it. Instead, she reached for the ballpoint pen in her jacket pocket, the one she used to mark for sites and note patient names, and snapped the barrel clean with her thumb. The rain on her face felt like clarity. Pain is data. She'd learned that in Helmand Province, learned it again in the years that followed. Every sensation told you something. The coolness of the morning. The metallic taste of adrenaline. The weight of the pen in her hand. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where anatomy and survival intersected. One motion. Precision born from 20 years of muscle memory she was supposed to have forgotten. The hiss of air escaping. It was the sound of pressure releasing, of a lung beginning to re-expand, of Morrison's chest cavity remembering how to work. His gasping changed immediately, still struggling, still desperate, but the sound of a man who might actually breathe again instead of slowly asphyxiating while conscious. She didn't remove the pen. Didn't need to. The barrel was doing its job, creating a one-way valve, letting the trapped air escape without allowing it to re-enter. His oxygen saturation would be climbing now, though she had no monitor to confirm what her body already knew. His pulse steadied under her fingertips. The panicked thrashing in his eyes softened into something approaching fear instead of pure animal desperation. "Just stay still," she said, her voice level as flat water. "Help is coming." The sirens were already wailing in the distance, probably called by someone in the medical office building across the lot who'd heard the impact. Sarah didn't step back. She kept her hand on Morrison's neck, monitoring the carotid pulse, tracking the subtle shift in his breathing from gasping to labored to something almost resembling normal. Her other hand rested lightly on the pen barrel, making sure it stayed exactly where it needed to be. Dr. Sterling appeared at the edge of the parking lot maybe 90 seconds later, having apparently heard the sirens from inside the hospital. He was still in his operating room scrubs, still wearing his surgical loops pushed up on his forehead, the mark of a man who always wanted people to know he'd just come from something important. He saw the crashed car. He saw his prized resident slumped in the driver's seat. Then he saw Sarah, and his face did something strange, a flicker of something that looked like threat assessment. He fumbled for his phone, hand shaking in a way that Sarah understood immediately. Not shock. Not concern for Morrison. But the look of a man realizing that control had just shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. The ambulance pulled into the lot 2 minutes later, its lights painting the rainy morning in alternating red and white. Paramedics moved with the choreographed efficiency of people who'd responded to accidents 1,000 times before. The lead medic was a woman with sergeant stripe tattoos on her forearm and eyes that had seen enough to know the difference between a routine extraction and a life-or-death intervention. "What do we have?" the medic asked, already reaching for her jump bag, already assessing. Sarah stepped back just enough to give the medic access, but not so far that Morrison's breathing pattern changed. Tension pneumothorax. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Pen decompression, 75 seconds ago. Pressure released, breathing improved, pulse stable at, she glanced at the carotid, still monitoring even as she spoke, 104 and dropping. The medic's head snapped toward Sarah, and something in her face shifted. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. The look a warrior gives another warrior when they've just witnessed precision under pressure. You saved his life, the medic said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't praise, exactly. It was diagnosis, the way a doctor might confirm a treatment protocol. She moved into position to manage Morrison's airway while her partner cut the door open with hydraulic tools, the metal shrieking in protest. Sterling stood motionless at the edge of the parking lot, watching. His hands had stopped shaking. Something harder had replaced the panic in his face, a calculation, a recalibration. The pen barrel still protruded from Morrison's chest, the single most visible proof of what had just happened, what Sarah had just done without orders, without authorization, without a single doctor standing over her shoulder nodding approval. As the paramedics loaded Morrison onto the gurney and began rolling him toward the ambulance bay, Sterling turned away from the scene and walked back toward the hospital entrance. His posture was different now, no longer the man who'd just witnessed an emergency. This was the posture of someone who'd just identified a problem. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he spoke to the cluster of staff members who'd emerged from the hospital to watch the extraction. Everyone inside. Now. Sarah wiped the rain from her face and walked to the bus stop, her hands still steady, her breathing still measured, the weight of what she'd just done settling into the place where all her other secrets lived. The pen barrel. The procedure. The 90 seconds of muscle memory she wasn't supposed to have anymore. The decision she'd made to use skills that belonged to a woman who'd been officially erased 20 years ago. She didn't know, standing there in the rain as the bus pulled up, that Sterling was already inside the hospital making phone calls. She didn't know that he'd interpreted her competence as a threat, her skill as a liability, her presence at that exact moment in that exact place as the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to his carefully constructed authority. She didn't know that within 72 hours, she would be sitting in a termination meeting, her references being questioned, her past being weaponized, her entire carefully constructed life in Portland about to collapse. But muscle memory doesn't lie. Some part of her, the part that had survived 3 deployments in Helmand province and the particular violence of being officially forgotten by the country you'd bled for, some part of her already knew what was coming. She needed some jello. Dr. Sterling's phone call to board member Patterson lasted exactly 4 minutes. The conversation was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated, that anyone listening might have heard the architecture of a man who'd spent 20 years learning how to dismantle people through institutional machinery. Patricia, Sterling said into his office phone at 11:24 p.m., the careful timing of a man who knew Walsh would be alone in administration, we have a significant liability on the graveyard shift. A nurse named Chen. She's been practicing medicine without supervision. I have witnesses. I have documentation. And frankly, it's a lawsuit waiting to happen. By noon the next day, he'd activated his network. 3 board members. Chief Financial Officer Reynolds, who owed Sterling a referral for his brother-in-law's cardiology position. Board Chair Hayes, whose daughter worked under Sterling's mentorship. Hospital Counsel Michael Torres, whom Sterling had done a favor for regarding a DUI that never appeared in court records. The calls were brief. Clinical. I need you to know that we may have a compliance issue, Sterling said, voice tinged with concern that felt authentic because Sterling had rehearsed it 17 times in his shower that morning. He knew how to sound like a man burdened by duty rather than revenge. The investigators arrived on Wednesday morning. External auditors from a firm called Cressmorne Compliance, 3 accountants in dark suits who smelled like coffee and rental car upholstery. Sterling had paid them himself through a consulting retainer, something that would never appear in the hospital's official budget. Their job was simple: audit every shift Sarah Chen had worked in the past 12 months. Find something. Anything. A missed signature on a chart. A medication administered 1 minute late. A patient complaint buried in satisfaction surveys. Crestmont's lead auditor, a man named Derek Voss with the personality of a filing cabinet, set up in an office adjacent to the ER. He requested 673 charts. He pulled security footage from parking lots. He interviewed night shift staff one by one, and Sterling had already prepared them with a rehearsed narrative. She's always helping when she shouldn't. Going beyond her scope. It's actually kind of dangerous. The auditors worked 18-hour days. They were very, very good at finding problems even when problems were microscopic. By Friday afternoon, they had their ammunition. 14 protocol deviations. None of them serious. A patient needing discharge paperwork processed 3 minutes early because Sarah recognized he was in pain and wanted him comfortable. A medication check done 5 minutes before the physician's order was technically written, though the order was already in the system, just not timestamped correctly. She'd once advocated loudly for an ultrasound on a patient showing early signs of compartment syndrome. The ultrasound had been ordered by the physician an hour later. No one called it what it was, Sarah being right. They called it Sarah stepping outside her lane. Sterling read the audit results in his office while drinking a $14 pour-over coffee. He smiled the way a man smiles when he's just been handed exactly what he needs. Enough for termination, Voss had written in his summary. Clear pattern of scope creep and unauthorized clinical decision-making. Recommend immediate action. Sterling forwarded it to Patricia Walsh at 4:33 p.m. with a subject line, urgent, compliance review complete. The termination meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 a.m. in Conference Room 2B, a space specifically designed to feel impersonal. The walls were beige. The table was pressboard. The fluorescent lights hummed with the particular sound of institutional power, not loud, but inescapable. Sarah had been called into the meeting without explanation, which was itself a message. She walked in at 8:58 a.m. carrying nothing. No notebook. No phone. Just her hands, which she folded on the table in front of her. Patricia Walsh sat on one side. Dr. Sterling on the other. Walsh was trying very hard to look neutral, which meant she'd already decided the outcome. She was 53 years old, had worked in hospital administration for 27 years, and had terminated perhaps 200 employees. This one felt different in a way she couldn't articulate. There was something in the nurse's posture, not defiant, not anxious, but something like acceptance, that made Walsh's stomach turn slightly. Sterling's face was a mask of professional concern. He was wearing his white coat even though he'd been in the office all morning. The coat was theatre. Everything about him was theatre. Walsh slid the termination letter across the table. Sarah, she said, her voice soft in the way HR voices become when they're delivering bad news, we've completed a comprehensive audit of your employment record. We found multiple protocol violations. We need to discuss them with you. The letter sat between them. Sarah didn't reach for it immediately. She read it where it lay, effective date of termination, today. Reason, gross violations of protocol. Practicing medicine without physician supervision. Unauthorized clinical decision-making. The language was sterile and comprehensive, like reading her own autopsy written by someone who'd never actually looked at the body. The needle decompression, Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of a man stating facts that pained him, was an assault on a patient. You punctured his chest with a ballpoint pen without any physician authorization. Without proper equipment. Without. He was dying, Sarah said. Her voice was perfectly level. The voice of a woman who'd stated facts in much worse circumstances than this. Tension pneumothorax. Cardiac arrest in progression. You would have lost him in the time it took for the cath lab team to arrive. He'd have been flatlined before anyone could do anything. That's not your decision to make, Walsh said, and she meant it. The rules existed for a reason. Scope of practice kept things organized. It kept nurses in their lane and doctors in theirs. He would have died, Sarah repeated. Not an argument. A statement of medical fact. Sterling leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge that sounded like reluctant authority. You've also violated protocol on 14 other occasions in the past year. Early discharge paperwork. Advocating for imaging you weren't qualified to recommend. Going to physicians with clinical concerns they didn't ask for. You've created a pattern of practice that puts Sacred Heart at significant liability. I saved his life, Sarah said. She looked directly at Sterling for the first time. Her eyes were the color of dark water, and there was something in them that made Sterling's throat feel slightly tight, though he pushed the feeling away. I did what any trained medical professional would do in that situation. You're not a trained medical professional, Walsh said gently. You're a nurse. And nurses don't perform needle decompressions. Sarah stood. She picked up the termination letter. She folded it once and held it in her right hand, the hand that had held pressure on a gunshot wound while calling for backup on a radio that had been dropped in sand. The hand that had felt a 5-year-old's heart racing against her chest during a Taliban ambush. The hand that had been trained by the United States Navy to make decisions when death was the alternative. I understand, she said. And she did. She understood perfectly. She understood that Sterling had orchestrated this with the kind of institutional precision that would be nearly impossible to challenge. She understood that the hospital would protect itself over any individual, even an individual who'd just saved a man's life. She understood that sometimes the system worked exactly as it was designed to work, protecting the hierarchy, maintaining the structure, sacrificing the person who stepped outside their assigned box. She walked toward the door. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you, Walsh called after her. Your health insurance coverage ends Friday. Sarah didn't turn around. She pushed through the conference room door and walked down the corridor where she'd walked 10,000 nights. Past the ER where Dr. Morrison was probably already back to work, probably already not thinking about the moment his heart stopped and a nurse with no authorization brought him back. Past the nurses' station where young nurses looked up and then quickly looked away, afraid of what proximity to her termination might cost them. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax and hand sanitizer filled the corridor, a smell that had been in her nostrils more than her own apartment for 18 years. At the main entrance, she paused. The doors were glass. Beyond them, the afternoon was cool and grey. Portland sky was doing that thing it did in March, where it looked less like weather and more like the color of surrender. She left at 4:36 p.m. on a Monday with a box the security guard had provided. Inside was her insulated mug, cracked on one side from the time she dropped it during a code, and her succulent, which had been dying for 3 months no matter how much water she gave it. She'd added one more thing herself before leaving, the photograph. Her squad from Helmand. 12 faces. 4 of them dead. 3 of them she'd never heard from again. The rest scattered like dust across the country, officially forgotten, practically erased. She kept it in a plastic sleeve because the original had been worn soft at the corners from touching it so many times. By 8:15 p.m., Sarah stood at the corner of Morrison and 4th Street under a bus stop that barely qualified as shelter. The rain was the kind of rain that Portland did well, not violent, just absolutely committed to the idea of soaking you completely. It fell against her face and ran down her neck. Her clothes stuck to her skin like the scrubs she'd worn for a decade and a half. The box got soaked. The cardboard began to soften and fail. The succulent didn't care. It was already dead. She looked at the photograph through the plastic, water streaming down. The image was slightly warped now. The faces blurred at the edges. She touched the unit patch inside her jacket, the faded fabric, worn soft from 20 years of being hidden. An Army Ranger unit patch. A relic of a life that had been officially erased, buried deep in classified files and redacted documents and the kinds of decisions made in Pentagon offices by people who'd never seen sand or blood or the look on a child's face when gunfire started. A bus pulled up. The doors hissed open. The driver looked at her, a woman standing in the rain with a disintegrating cardboard box, soaked to the skin. He waited. Sarah held the box tighter and stepped back. The bus pulled away, taking with it a future that included some kind of forward momentum. She was still standing there at 9:41 p.m. when her phone buzzed in her pocket. The text was from an unknown number. "Mom, where are you?" Followed by, "We need to talk. I found something in the attic." She stared at the words for a long time. Rain continued to fall. The box continued to fall apart. And somewhere in a house she barely lived in anymore, her 16-year-old son had discovered a shadow box hidden under the insulation in the attic. Inside that box were medals. A Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Bronze star with Valor. 3 purple hearts. Each one a story she'd been told never to tell. Each one a piece of a life that was supposed to stay buried. She didn't respond to the text. She just looked at her phone, then at the photograph through the plastic, then up at the Portland sky, which was still that color of surrender. The rain hammered against the bus stop shelter, against her shoulders, against the box that was coming apart in her hands. Around her, the city moved. Cars drove past. Lights changed. Normal people lived normal lives where nobody tried to erase them, where their hands didn't know how to save people because their hands had been trained by trauma instead of textbooks. She needed Jell-O, she thought distantly. Or maybe that was just the voice of Sarah Chen, night shift nurse, speaking from a distance that felt like it was already becoming historical. Because standing in the rain with a destroyed box and a dying succulent and a photograph of ghosts, Sarah Chen the nurse was already starting to become something else. The question was whether anyone would recognize her when she did. The conference room at Sacred Heart felt different when the board convened at 9 in the morning. Not because the mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, or because Patricia Walsh, the chief administrator, had arranged the chairs in a deliberate hierarchy. It felt different because Dr. Marcus Sterling stood at the head of that table like a man who had already won, his navy suit tailored to precision, his expression arranged into the face of someone who had simply done his job. The termination paperwork lay in front of each board member, 14 documented protocol violations, each one Sterling had orchestrated through external auditors and falsified performance reviews. This was formality now. Sterling had already counted his victory. 3 board members were checking their phones. One was reviewing her own liability exposure. Nobody was thinking about Sarah Chen anymore. She was already gone, already erased, already just another nurse who couldn't hack it in an institution that required obedience over competence. Sterling had learned long ago that the system protected its own. That doctrine was about to meet a force it didn't have a category for. The conference room doors opened. Patricia Walsh looked up, her pen frozen mid-signature. Every head turned. A teenage boy stood in the doorway holding a shadow box, his hands trembling slightly but his jaw set with the kind of determination that doesn't arrive from nowhere. He couldn't have been more than 17, but he moved into that room like someone had told him exactly what the cost of his next words would be and he was paying it anyway. Behind him, visible for just a moment in the hallway, was Sarah. She wasn't looking at Sterling. She was looking at her son. The boy stepped forward and set the shadow box on the mahogany table with the care of someone placing something sacred. His voice cracked once, then steadied. "Mom, they need to see these." Under the glass gleamed a Navy Cross. Bronze and gold and ribbon the color of blood. Beneath it, arranged in precise rows, sat medals most of these board members had never seen outside of movies. Patricia Walsh stood up. So did 3 others. Sterling's hand moved toward the papers as if he could still control what happened next through sheer force of will. Captain Jason Matthews stepped through the doors in full dress uniform. The Army Ranger officer they'd all been told was recovering in room 407, the patient Sterling had claimed wasn't Sarah's responsibility. The recovered patient. The living one. Matthews moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been written in places most people would never survive, and he approached the table with the formal respect of a subordinate addressing a superior. His eyes found Sarah for one moment. Acknowledged her? Then he addressed the room. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. The room went dead silent. Matthews opened a personnel file with the kind of bureaucratic weight that only the Pentagon could carry. Classified until 6 hours ago. My father, General Raymond Matthews, 4-star, obtained this authorization personally. What's contained in this file details 20 years of service that the United States government ordered her to forget. Service that saved lives you'll never know about. Sterling's face was changing color. Not red. Not anger. The color of someone watching their foundation dissolve in real time. That's classified information, Sterling started, his voice climbing. That's federal property. Patricia Walsh cut him off with a gesture that didn't require words. Just a hand raised slightly. One movement. It was enough. A SEAL team leader walked in. Mid-50s, scarred hands, eyes that had seen decisions made in fractions of a second. He stood beside Captain Matthews and looked directly at the medals in the shadow box. His voice was quiet when he spoke. Low and steady and carrying the weight of someone testifying about the dead. Bronze Star. He paused. Let the room absorb it. For leadership under fire during Operation Mountain Rescue, 2004. His eyes moved to the next decoration. Silver Star. Operation Helmand Province, 2006. 17 lives saved. Including my son. She was 28 years old and she moved through enemy territory like she was reading a map only she could see. Sterling pushed his chair back. Started to stand. Someone in the room moved to block the doorway. The SEAL team leader continued, his voice not rising, just continuing like a man reading names of the fallen at a memorial. Second Silver Star. 2007, direct intervention during a Taliban ambush. 2 operators down. She extracted both under heavy fire. He turned directly to Sterling. You had the chance to work beside a decorated warrior and you spent a week trying to break her. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Doctor. The last word wasn't a title. It was a threat disguised as respect. The FBI special agent arrived like weather moving in from the coast. Diane Torres, dark suit, the kind of calm that comes from having ended careers before breakfast. She placed documents on the mahogany table with the precision of someone dealing cards. Her voice was conversational. Almost friendly. Dr. Sterling, we need to discuss your attempts to access classified military personnel records. Sterling's hand went to his lawyer's arm. The lawyer hadn't even arrived yet. Additionally, when that failed, your external investigators used credentials you provided in an attempt to breach Department of Defense databases. Federal crime. You then fabricated performance reviews and falsified documentation to justify termination of a service member operating under protected status. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Torres continued like he hadn't even tried to speak. The forged documents alone carry a 5-year federal sentence. The false reports to the board carry another 3. The obstruction of justice while attempting to cover your tracks adds 18 months. She looked at Patricia Walsh. I recommend the board cooperate fully with federal investigators and provide all documentation regarding Dr. Sterling's communications. Patricia Walsh nodded. Didn't even hesitate. The room had already made its decision. Sterling was already a ghost. He just didn't know it yet. The board members physically distanced themselves from him. Chairs scraped backward like a single synchronized movement. Patricia Walsh spoke with the voice of someone reading from a script that had been written the moment Sarah's terminated status had been questioned by people with the authority to question anything. Dr. Sterling, you are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Sterling stood. His hands moved through the air like he was trying to grab something tangible. You saved Morrison. I was protecting the hospital from liability. Any administrator would have. Sarah stood. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She simply rose from where she'd been standing beside her son and walked to face Sterling directly. Her voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes people lean in, the kind that carries more authority than shouting ever could. You didn't care about liability. She paused. One breath. You cared that I challenged you. That a nurse knew more than you in front of your residents. Sarah's hands moved to her sides. Steady. Not trembling. Never trembling. I served under commanders in places where one wrong call meant death. They listened to every voice because lives mattered more than ego. Sterling's face was darkening now, his jaw clenching. Rage and panic mixing into something that looked almost feral. You lied about who you were, Captain Matthews stepped forward. His voice was soft but it landed like concrete. She was ordered to lie. By the United States government. You were ordered to do nothing except treat patients. You turned healing into a power game. Matthews paused. Let that settle. That's the difference between us. That's the difference between service and just wearing the title. Agent Torres nodded to her partner. They approached Sterling with handcuffs that caught the fluorescent light like a verdict. The articulation of consequence. Sterling's lawyer had arrived, but it was too late. The words came like a ritual. Rights read while the board members watched in a silence that felt almost sacred. Obstruction of justice. Attempted unauthorized access to classified information. Falsifying federal employment records. The handcuffs clicked. The sound was small, but it carried through the room like a gavel strike. Sterling was escorted through Sacred Heart's main hallway in full dress of his defeat. The parking lot. His office. Everywhere he'd walked like he owned the institution. Nurses lined the corridors. Not staged. Not planned. Word had spread the way it does in hospitals, through the underground network of people who talk when the powerful aren't listening. One older nurse, the one Sterling had nicknamed Grandma in public, stood in the second row. Met his eyes. Didn't look away. Didn't smile. Just watched him pass like he was someone she'd already decided to forget. Security placed Sterling in the FBI vehicle. His reflection visible in Sacred Heart's windows as dozens of staff watched from inside. As Sarah watched. As her son watched. As Captain Matthews, still in full dress uniform, watched. The doors of the hospital remained open. They always did. That was the whole point. 6 months later, Sarah Chen walked through those same doors. The white coat had her name embroidered over the pocket. Director of Emergency Medicine. The title meant something different now because the woman wearing it had already proven that titles were just permission slips for people who needed them. Inside the jacket lining, sewn with the kind of meticulous care that comes from hands that had held it together through worse than any institutional system, was the faded Army Ranger unit patch. Matthews had given it to her the day she carried him through gunfire in Helmand Province when he was 5 years old and she was 23. She'd kept it folded in jackets ever since. A promise. A memory. A secret that had finally stopped being a secret and become what it always was underneath. Evidence of who she actually was. Sarah ran morning rounds with residents, moving through the emergency department with the authority of someone who had earned it in places that didn't have boards or committees or titles on office doors. Every voice at this table matters, she told them. I don't care if you're a first-year resident or a custodian, if you see something wrong, you speak up. Hierarchy exists, but it doesn't make you blind. It doesn't make you right. A young nurse hesitated, then raised her hand. Corrected a medication order softly. Sarah nodded. Good catch. Thank you. The nurse's shoulders relaxed. That was the architecture of a different kind of institution. One built on listening. Across Portland, Sterling taught CPR at a community college for minimum wage. His students didn't know he'd been a surgeon. He was just the guy who demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His hands moved through the motions like muscle memory without meaning. The job had no hierarchy. No residents to impress. No one who cared about his credentials. Just bodies to train and a paycheck that arrived on schedule. In her office at Sacred Heart, Sarah kept 3 items on her desk. The cracked mug, repaired now with gold kintsugi that turned the break into something beautiful. The succulent, thriving. The photograph of her squad, half of them dead, the rest scattered across systems that pretended they'd never existed. She'd retrieved all of it from the cardboard box. Gave it a new context. Captain Matthews visited weekly for physical therapy. His limp improving. They didn't talk much about Helmand Province. There wasn't anything left to say about it. The understanding lived in the silence between them. Morrison, fully recovered from the parking lot emergency that had changed everything, transferred his fellowship to Sacred Heart specifically to work under Sarah. He told her once, "You saved my life twice. Once in the parking lot. Once by showing me what real leadership looks like." She'd nodded. That was enough. Sarah's final moment arrived on an evening when rain fell softly on the parking lot where it had all begun. The same lot where she'd performed needle decompression with a ballpoint pen and trauma-honed instincts while Sterling fumbled with his phone. Jason, her son, met her there after his army recruiter appointment. He decided to enlist. He stood in his civilian clothes while his mother stood in her white coat with the director's title and the hidden patch sewn inside the lining. She embraced him the way she'd learned to embrace people, fully, completely, like she meant it. "Serve with honor," she whispered. "Listen to everyone. Rank doesn't equal wisdom. Remember that." He nodded. Then he asked the question that had been waiting underneath everything. "Mom, what makes someone a real warrior?" Sarah's hand moved to the patch inside her jacket. The faded unit designation. The promise kept. She looked towards Sacred Heart's entrance where nurses were arriving for night shift, where patients moved through doors seeking healing, where battles were fought with steady hands and calm voices. Her voice when she answered was the voice of someone who had spent 20 years learning the truth. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." She smiled. They walked back toward the hospital together, her son watching with pride as she disappeared into the building. The camera pulled back to show the parking lot empty except for rain puddles reflecting Sacred Heart's lights. Everything had changed there. Everything continued changing there. That was how healing worked. If Sarah's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, please subscribe for more stories about quiet strength and earned authority. Like this video and comment, what would you have done in Sterling's position before you realized who you were really dealing with?